Right. Okay. Better a super chair than a super ego, I guess. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for the generous invitation. Make sure I don't poke myself with this. For the generous invitation, it's a pleasure to be among you. I've just arrived from New York about 10 minutes ago. In a way to be part of a restoration of academic discourse after the semi-longue durée of Zooming everything, although we're still Zooming, obviously, and to celebrate such important institutions in a vital global city. I thought what I would do here, a role I might play is to talk about global forces that shape or contour the national and regional ones that we'll spend most of the next few days talking about. Of course, it's a cliche to say, I'm sure it's probably already come up, that we are at a crossroads in our connected instability, at whose core, and it's already alluded to, is the geopolitics of global interdependence. Now, the roads fork in three directions. There are the catastrophists. That is the road that leads to decomposition and backlashing. I think we're all very familiar with it. The whole image of the four horsemen of famine, pestilence, war, and death is in the outline of the description of this event. And of course, there's no shortage of evidence to justify that doom scenario or that road. So, but it's one. There is another, the renewalist road, one might call it. And one might ask, are we seeing the deliverance of a new compact across borders? And you can hear this voice coming particularly from within the Biden administration in the efforts to revive what some see as the zombie of liberal internationalism. This winter, of course, will be the testing ground for whether we can, whether the renewalists will survive. And then there's a third path, which is the muddling path. Can we keep muddling through as we have? We've managed to avoid a complete breakdown, but struggle to make ground on the challenges that are crying out to be addressed, like the global environmental rift. Now, I think, frankly, that we are most likely to continue muddling through for reasons I'll explain. Not because it's optimal or preferred, it's certainly not glamorous, but we are stuck in a kind of mid-level global equilibrium trap. We are able to contain immediate shocks like financial crises, pandemics, even invasions. We'll come back to that. But the institutions and values that manage the immediate are less well suited for the slower boiling kinds of problems like the energy transition and the global migrant crisis. And the effect of this is a new global cleavage between North and South, for the costs borne especially by the global South and the benefits of the muddling through strategy hoarded by the global North. And one saw this on display in the response of vaccine nationalism on the parts of the vaccine producers of the North. And one can see evidence of the backlash from the South already evident in the response to the invasion of Ukraine, of Bolsonaro's, this is a region I work on, nationalism, as a response to the pressure of international conservation movements to stop burning the Amazon. So the global fault lines do not only run along the liberal versus illiberal schisms. But we have immediate shocks then, or episodic shocks or crises within a larger structural one, or if you want, crises within a crisis. Now, somewhere there was going to be a slide I might allude to. I can keep going, but I sent a PowerPoint beforehand. The clicker here? And if I hit green, will we all blow up? Let's see what happens, shall we? Okay, there we go. There's the slide. Okay, thank you. We survived. That could have been bad. Anyway, I'll come back to this chart. It's based on data from Oxford. But let me start with a distinction. And the distinction is one borrowed from Albert Hirschman between integrative and disintegrative crises. Integrative crises for Hirschman were those that summon fresh ideas and new thinking and coalitions. That is, faced with shared threats and challenges, integrative crises are those that yield to collective responses. Disintegrative crises, on the other hand, trap actors into a sense of intractable tensions and hostility. The governance of zero-summism, where shared threats produce sauve qui peut disintegrative responses. So one can imagine a fire in a lecture hall, and instead of teaming up to put it out, everybody runs for the exits. And the question now is whether we are integrating or fracturing or disintegrating. In fact, we are always doing both, which makes the current crisis hard to characterize. But it therefore has the possibility of veering in one direction or the other. 10 years ago, there was a sense that the world might have been summoning these integrative responses to the challenges. One example was the culmination with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which is a kind of shadow to the story I'm going to talk about, which has to do with energy and nuclear threats, and the curbs on the nuclear program in return for relief on sanctions. 5 years ago, the feeling was decidedly the opposite. The turning point, in fact, may have been the invasion of Crimea and the Syrian exodus. Certainly by 2018, when Donald Trump tore up the Iran nuclear deal, it felt like we were in for a very, very bleak period in world history. Now, of course, it's less clear, and we face a decisive winter. What I want to do now is pull back and look at this chart, unpack it, and look at two crises, one disintegrative and the other integrative, the 1930s and the 1970s, and the way the global system responded to those crises. The 30s, as the chart practically speaks for itself, was a disintegrative crisis. The financial blows of 1929, rising unemployment, the liberal capitalist system, which had already been stressed by the First World War, folded up. But it was not just the break up or breakdown of an economic system. We need more than an economic explanation for the shifts in the global imaginaries to explain what happened with the breakdown. It was a rift also in what Raymond Williams calls a structure of feeling. For the anxieties in particular, and I'll draw attention to the human-nature relationship, which is why the energy question is a through line here. And the rise of the narrative, or dominant narrative, of doom, panic, and neo-Malthusianism. And Shalini and I have had this long-going conversation about doing something global on the relationship between demography and democracy. One expression of this was ecological panic about access to oil, to resources, in particular oil and to fertile land. Japan, Germany, in fact, Anglo-American geographers were all fretting about the end of the open land cycle that had opened up with the conquest of the Americas after 1492. So the sense of scarcity of access to resources. The second was that overlapped with the first, was with the rise of a brand of nationalism, and it was only one brand, which identified self-determination, democracy, and modernity with the conditions of national homogeneity and healthy bodies. And so that's why the gender issue is central to how we might think about the current crisis. This fusion of the two, the sense of scarcity and the identification of democracy with homogeneous nation states, fueled greater suspicion about strangers. What was called the minority problem at home and immigration restrictions everywhere began to proliferate and culminated in a style of geostrategy or geopolitik, of hoarding and competing. This is what trade wars are. Remember, free trade is a form of entrustment to strangers. So the world became a menacing place. Depending on strangers, or what we now call globalization, I would rather we set that term aside and talk about interdependence, was an existential threat. And the response was detachment and dehumanization of the threat. The result was horror, set off by a Japanese invasion of Manchuria, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, and culminated, of course, with Lebensraum geopolitik. Now, there were, as I said earlier, there are always combined systems of integration and disintegration functioning at the same time. And there were efforts to cooperate and resolve collective action problems, even efforts to deepen the disarmament movement well into 1930s, and sanctions against invaders. And that's why the whole debate around the Italian invasion of Abyssinia was, one might say, a real turning point. And they were pushed to rally coalitions to think about public health globally. There's a lot of literature now on this. But the guardrails collapsed. Competing states turned predatory. Look at the curves. This was also a decade of democratic reversal. And we might think about what the relationship is between these global transformations and rifts and national or regional ones. This was a moment where the global breakdown undermined democracy, and autocracy tilted countries to compete over cooperation. And the spiral went downwards and carried the curves to their bottom. Let's flip to the 1970s. This was also a shock, of course. Make sure this works. There we go. It was a shock with similar features to it: a financial crisis, the US balance of payments out of control. In 1971, Richard Nixon takes the dollar off the gold standard, a global paralysis in the international payment system. We forget now that one of the responses to 1971, from 1971 all the way to 1974, was to impose more capital controls and currency exchange restrictions in Germany, France, and elsewhere, not less. People who think that the process of the drive towards neoliberalism was beginning by the late 1960s forget these countervailing forces. And we often forget that the end of the gold standard and the end of the Bretton Woods system was only part of Richard Nixon's shock. In August 1971, Nixon blindsided American trading partners with a 10% surcharge on imports. He embargoed essential foodstuffs on Japan. Protection was a response to perceived threats coming from strangers. And there was, of course, also a world historical war in 1973 that produced an oil shock and intensified the urge to hoard and externalize the blame. These multiplying shocks, as we're saying, revealed a new pattern of dependency on the part of the United States itself, something we might come back to in the discussion, what that means when the global superpower is itself becoming more aware of its vulnerability. What about the Williams structure of feeling at the time? And here, I think, is why we need to have not economic causes for how economic or political economic crises unfold. Here too, catastrophists rode in on their horses. Neo-Malthusian came back to life. The return of declinist narratives and predictions of Armageddon abounded. In 1968, the Population Bomb book, I don't know if any of you have read Paul Ehrlich's book, but it's remarkable to reread many decades later, the spread of the metaphor of the tragedy of the commons. And of course, the 1972 report from the Club of Rome on the limits to growth. And of course, the original Mad Max movie and the rage for post-apocalypsis. The symbol for this mood was not the uplifting 1968 photograph of Earthrise, but the more precarious image of a planet, the blue marble shot of 1972, that solitary orb floating alone in a black universe. This was a mood ripe for panic, hoarding, and dehumanizing strangers. Depending on strangers was a threat. No longer the image, no stronger image of this was there, in a sense, than the ways in which Arab wealth got portrayed in the Western media. So there was a structure of feeling that legitimated the turn to zero-summism. But there were other, as I said, warring propensities in the structure of feeling. And a peace movement and nuclear disarmament, human rights movements, cross-border environmental cooperations over things like acid rain, water management, control and curbs on CFCs and the Montreal Protocol, there was a counterweight to the narrative of the strangers as existential threats. So that deepening interdependence with integration was a way to diminish the threat. So there was a counter narrative to the neo-Malthusian sense of threat. And the shift in global norms and narratives that restrained powerful states from defecting from the rules that they had designed. And so movements and institutions attached to these norms pushed back, and they functioned on a new scale even, a scale of transnational politics. And to some extent, these transnational affiliations of movements and norms reflected itself a disenchantment with nationalist politics. And the issue now about what nationalism means in reaction to transnationalism is something we might talk about. And these movements were effective in resetting interdependence and gave the world a new integrative impulse. And if we were to go back to those curves, you would see the slope coming upwards in the wake of the 1970s. There were, of course, just qualifiers, two forces, material forces that enabled this change in the structure of feeling. One, of course, was the rise of new forms of credit and financialization and the turn towards debt-led growth, especially for the developing world, but now for the so-called developed world as well. And the second was carbonization. Remember, more carbon was burned from 1980 to 2008 than all of human history before then. So ironically, at the time, it was enabled by the decline of the Middle East as in its command over a share of the world's petroleum supplies, which reached its peak at about 50% of world petroleum supply in 1973. So this was a condition for this new model of deepening interdependence and transnational politics. Okay, so that's it for the two contrasts. Yep, I'm almost done. I would just want to add two notes to this stylized narrative. The first is that disintegration is not anti-global. That is a mistake. It was a mistaken reading of Donald Trump and Brexit and so on. Disintegrationists are not isolationists. Not even autarks want autarky. They wanted to rebuild interdependence in more hierarchical way and predatory ways. And this is important for understanding the geopolitics of Trump, Putin, and others. While they railed against globalism, what they really aimed to do is to do away with the horizontal pattern of interdependence between strangers, or the kind of cosmopolitan imaginary for the world, who's dominated by concerns and curiosities about strangers. Hoarding the returns for interdependence and externalizing the costs onto strangers. The threat then isn't a return to isolationism, but to predation and the weaponization of dependency. That's one quality. The second is that disintegration and integration don't obey mechanical laws. They are latent in any crisis. And the question is, which forces prevail in the struggle? And that's why I signaled the autonomy and the importance of the structure of feeling, especially in the narratives and norms that govern the emotional ties to strangers and the spectrum of love to loathing. Where does that leave us now? So this will end in the shadow of the pandemic and invasion and the extreme febrility in the Persian Gulf. We tend to think in doomsday-ish framings. Even the summons for this symposium echoes it for totally understandable reasons. But it's worth saying that since 2008 financial shock, we have faced not a breakdown, but a slowdown. The institutions managed to prevent a complete meltdown of the financial system, just as the institutions more or less prevented the pandemic from being much worse than it could have been, which included the mobilization of international scientific networks. And one might say that the same alliances are at work in responding to the act of predation and invasion coming from Putin's government. And we are even seeing the return to talks between Washington and Tehran on restoring the nuclear pact. We may look back at Trump's decision in 2018 to tear up the Iran nuclear deal as the 21st century's Cuban Missile Crisis, the bullet that we dodged. we go into details about what happened in the American elections in the fall of 2020 and how much Trump was egging the Iranians on to do something so that he could justify going to war. There is now evidence to show that there was, I'm going to lose control of this presentation if I go down that rabbit hole. I have to say, though, this is, of course, very uneven and extremely precarious. That's, of course, why we are at a crossroads. For the propensity to disintegrate and to integrate coexist. The difference now is that compared to 1970s is that the institutions and ideas that proved important for global thinking and transnational politics are now tired and exhausted. They prevent calamities, but don't have restorative powers. And it's in this mid-level equilibrium trap that fuels the narrative wars because incumbent ideas seem so exhausted and their legitimacy drained. Even more, the trap obstructs the progress on global collective action problems when faced with different, more structural threats, like inequalities of the global migrant crisis and the energy transition. So we are in a paradoxical bind. Our institutions help us muddle through. They prevent calamities like nuclear war so far, or more menacing pandemics like Ebola, and maybe even signal to predators that they can become pariahs. But they also prevent the crisis from breaking up the obstacles to deeper change. Thank you very much.